Anna, you're muted.
Sorry, everyone. That was a bit of a mistake. Thanks, Geoff. So hi again, everyone. This is Anna from the TEC on another webinar. And I've got three colleagues with me, also from the TEC. We've got Geoff, Anjum and Suha, and I'll be getting them to introduce themselves more in a minute. They're from our economics team here in Congress House. But I'm just going to go through a little bit of our housekeeping for the webinar. As usual, we've got live captions. Underneath the video screen, there's a green button. If you want to follow along with captions, click that and they'll open a new window where you can follow with the captions. As ever, you can also ask a question of our speakers. So please post your question in the Ask a Question panel right at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to some of those after we've heard from Geoff, Anjum and Suha. And it's great to see some of you already using the chat panel on the right-hand side to introduce yourselves, and use it also, please, to exchange some ideas and any tips you might have about our subject. We're also recording today's webinar, so if you have to leave or you miss a part of it, don't worry, we'll be sending the link round to you later today, and you can view that at your leisure along with any resources that we might share. So I'm going to get our presentation loaded up and just ask Geoff to introduce himself first. Over to you, Geoff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anna. My name's Geoff Tily. I'm a senior economist at the TUC. I'm working from home today. Normally, I sit in that chair behind Anjum. And I'm just waiting for the slide. Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Shall we go to Andrew Bailey? Okay. Well, I'll start. Thank you all for coming along. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that these are incredibly challenging times. We have workers and households dealing with double-digit inflation. We have unions taking the fight to employers with some incredibly high-profile actions, but also hard negotiating and other campaigns across much of the economy. But it's not just on the industrial and business landscape. The same issues that we're interested in are issues of macroeconomic policy. And not for the first time, there's a sense that policy is operating against our interests. The Bank of England's role is to operate policy so that inflation is 2%, and they have put workers front and centre in the actions they're taking. Governor Bailey here is warning of a wage price spiral. As we speak, he's just announced the 8th increase in interest rates in a row since December. He's put up interest rates by 0.75% to 3%, which is pretty forceful going over this year. Then at the same time, we have the Treasury, who incorporate inflation into their arguments for pay restraint in the public sector. And more widely, after the disarray of the Truss government, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt seem to be trying to redeem the Conservative Party through a return to public spending cuts and austerity. The sum of the parts is hardship and the fear of recession. Up to a point, this isn't unique to us. Central banks around the world are raising interest rates, and the threat of recession is a global threat. In fact, the IMF a couple of weeks ago put out their latest assessment. You can see this in the 2023 column. They show the forecast for GDP growth they mainly focus on advanced economies. Then they're showing the GDP forecast slowing from 2.4% in 2022 to 1.1% in 2023. The countries they've picked out as having negative going into recession next year are Germany, which is not the norm, Germany being at the bottom of the pack, and then Italy falling by 0.2. In fact, in the bank's figures today, they went further than the IMF. And they said that the UK would fall by 1.5% next year and by 1% in 2024. So a 2-year recession, which they also expect to involve an increase in unemployment of 1 million. So they're tough conditions, but we'll come back to it, and I'll hand over to my colleagues to start talking about some of the detail.
Thanks, Geoff. Really grateful for you setting the scene there. And as you said, we will come back to some of these issues. But next, I've got a question for you, Suha. So can you start with the inflation context, please? How unprecedented is this situation that we're in now?
Well, inflation at the moment is incredibly high. CPI inflation is actually our 40-year high. It's currently 10.1%, and it's been over 9% for the last 6 months. RPI is 12.6%, it's been above 10% for 6 months as well. And this is after a period of very low inflation, as you can see in the graph. So it's suddenly shot up at a very quick rate. If you could just go on to the next slide, please. So over here, I've broken it down into columns. So the ONS gives different categories called divisions, which are different areas that people are spending on and how quickly inflation is growing in each of these areas. In the first column, we can see how quickly it grew in the 12 months to August, and then the next column, the 12 months to September. So we can see in most areas, in most of these divisions, inflation has been accelerating. And we can see that also it's been led by housing and household services, which is where the energy bills are coming in. That's been going up about 20% over the last year. And also food and non-alcoholic beverages, which is like normally grocery shopping and stuff like that. That's been going up very quickly. But really across the board, we're seeing incredibly high inflation. The only area that we can see that is not accelerating is transport, and that's mainly driven by fuel prices. They were incredibly high a while ago and sort of started to stabilize and come back down, and that's why they're starting to slow. But everything else, the price is just going up and up. So if we could go on to the next slide. And this graph also shows that this is since 2020 to 2022, you can see inflation has absolutely shot up. If I could just draw your attention to the dark yellow sort of bar in this bar graph, which represents housing and household services. And as I said, that's energy costs. You can see it absolutely became massive in April this year, which is reflects the energy price cap going up. If we could go to the next slide. And this has been the case all over the world. It's not just a UK-wide problem, it's global. In other countries, inflation has shot up since that period, and you can see that in the UK, it is incredibly high in some other but roughly in line with other countries. What is interesting is that in many other countries, it started to tail off. So in the US, you can see the purple line is reached its peak and it's coming back down. You can see that in some other countries as well, but it's not the case in the UK. It's continuing to go up quickly. So there's many reasons for this. The most notable is probably the war in Ukraine has led to shortages in global gas and electricity, which have led to energy prices going up. Also, it's affected food prices in terms of Ukraine being a massive exporter of grain and other food items such as oil. This slide demonstrates that during COVID, the economy was closed down. And then it's taken supply chains a while to gear back up now that demand has increased. So there was a sort of like blockage, as demonstrated by the ship, that has sort of caused ongoing problems and has led to quite high inflation. If we could go to the next slide, please. So there's 3 different measures of inflation you might see or be familiar with. CPI is the most common, which is 10.1%. It's used most widely, and it's quoted most widely by the media. It's been increasing and it's up 0.2% from last month. RPI tends to be the highest. It's useful to use in negotiations, and most unions will probably come in quoting RPI to start with. It's 12.6% at the moment, like I said earlier, and it's been increasing as well. And there's another slightly newer measure as well called CPIH that tends to be lower. The ONS has introduced it fairly recently, and it's 8.8%. It's going up at 0.2% as well from month to month. The main difference, so they're quite different in the way they're calculated, which leads to these discrepancies. The main difference is how they factor in housing costs. So all measures include some level of rental costs, but then raises in interest rates, you'll probably see through RPI most clearly. So that's what causes it to be a lot higher, and we'll probably, as interest rates continue to go up, as we saw today, it'll probably lead to RPI being quite consistently higher than the other two measures. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So that brings us on to pay.
And I've got another question for you here, Suha. Thank you for also, again, setting the scene and telling us how we really got to the situation we're in now. But what I want to know is what's happening to wages across the economy, because I think that's where people notice it the most. And how does inflation impact people's wages month in, month out?
Well, in this climate of high inflation, it's really important that wages are able to keep up with inflation. So I'll talk you through how we look at wages in general. So normally wages are measured on a weekly basis, and that's how they're calculated across the whole economy. And we tend to look at regular pay, which excludes bonuses. We've seen pretty low growth, to be honest, in wages, even in nominal terms, since the financial crisis. So they came down quite a lot during the financial crisis and haven't really picked up. This graph sort of follows it over the last 20 years. You can see that there's been movement, but it hasn't gone up significantly. This is the growth rate. So if we could go to the next slide. So we tend to, the TCV adjust it for inflation. So the real rate of pay has been much worse than the nominal rate that we saw on the page earlier. There's pretty much been no real growth of pay in the last 20 years, since the financial crash. And that's across all measures of inflation that I talked about earlier. You can see RPI is the lowest, and on that measure, we've had -6% real pay, but across the board, we've been losing money as workers. We're worse off than we were before the financial crisis. And that's true across the private sector and the public sector. Actually, the public sector have been very badly affected because of the public sector pay freeze. So the public sector workers are 7% worse off. Thank you. I've broken it down into different sectors of the economy. So as you can see, all workers are worse off compared to where they were previously on a year ago. But some are worse off than others. You can see at the very bottom end of the chart is arts, entertainment, and recreation, who've had massive problems coming out of COVID. Especially with the cost of living squeeze, these areas are really they're really under the cosh quite a lot, because people are cutting back on arts and recreation a lot. And then the other end of things, we're sort of seeing where pay growth has not been as bad as other sectors, such as wholesale trade. That's where workers have had a lot of leverage, and there's been these shortages of workers that have led to workers having more bargaining power. So at the TEC, we've kind of looked at long-term pay growth trends. And sort of before the financial crisis, real pay after inflation was rising, and workers were getting better off year on year. And that petered off completely, and we've had zero pay growth since then, really. We've had negative pay growth. We calculated that if wages had continued to rise at their pre-growth trend, we'd be at £181 better off a week, which translates to £9,000 a year, which is obviously an enormous difference.
Thank you very much, Suha, for putting that in the context of wages. But wages, as we know, can have a huge impact. So next, I want to put a question to you, Anjum, about what kind of pressures this wage spiral, this wage drop is having on households. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Sure. The impact that this is actually having on everyday life just really cannot be underestimated. I mean, I know we've just sort of given quite a lot of stats out there, kind of thing, but just in sort of like everyday life, I mean, our latest TUC poll showed that 1 in 7 people in the UK are skipping meals or going without food. Over 2/5 are having to cut back on food spending. Over half, 55% of the population, are cutting back on heating, hot water, or electricity, and around 1 in 12 of those polled report missing a payment of a household bill. Even before the current cost of living crisis, working families, along with non-working families, were struggling. Of those living in poverty, a record high 57% were working in working households, and 75% of children in poverty are also from working households. Deep cuts to social security for those both in and out of work have been a key plank of the government economic agenda over the past decade. And the TUC is deeply troubled by the failure of the current government to commit to increased benefits in line with at least inflation. The Spring Statement 2022 saw the annual social security increase rise well above the sharp rise in inflation. Well below the sharp rise in inflation. The standard allowance for universal credit and legacy benefits increased by 3.1% in April, when CPI inflation was in fact 9%. So you can see the difference there, and obviously inflation, as Suha mentioned earlier on, is now currently 10.1%.
Thanks, Anjum. It's really helpful getting that context. So you mentioned that there were some people who were harder hit than others. Can you talk a bit about the equalities impacts of inflation, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the rising costs are actually sort of hitting people across the board, but there are sort of huge variations in the abilities of families to cope. Lower income households spend a high proportion of their budget on food, housing, and energy, and hence are disproportionately affected. A recent ONS survey looked at the experiences of different groups of the population having difficulty affording or being behind on their energy, rent, or mortgage payments over the summer. The proportion of all adults finding it difficult to afford their energy bills, rent, or mortgage payments increased throughout the year. Almost half of adults who paid energy bills and 30% paying rent or mortgages reported paying difficulty. But looking a bit more sort of detail at the profile, over half, 55% of disabled adults reported finding it difficult to afford their energy bills, and around a third found it difficult to afford their rent or mortgage payments, compared with 40% and 27% of non-disabled people, respectively. Around 4 in 10 white adults reported finding it difficult to afford their energy bills, compared with around 2/3 for Black or Black British and around 6 in 10 for Asian or Asian British adults. Around half of those with a personal income of less than £20,000 per year said they found it difficult to afford their energy bills. This proportion decreased as personal income increased, with around a quarter of those earning 50,000 or more reporting this. I mean, this really is actually just showing you the struggle. You know, if you're sort of struggling on 50,000, and then you can just imagine how tough it is if you're on sort of median and low wages. You know, the choice is simply coming down to eating or not heating, and or whether you put the heating on or not.
Thanks, Anjum. It's really worrying to hear about our members, the profile of members who are disproportionately affected by these changes. So we're going to go back to Geoff now. So Geoff, we know that workplace reps are sometimes involved in pay negotiations in their workplace. So are there any economic arguments that might help them when negotiating? And if you could tell us about some of those, please.
Sure, Anna. Let me stress that I'm afraid I'm not a negotiator. Most of my time I'm communicating with my screen, but I do think that the analysis today and the wider economics points to some key issues. Most obviously and most simply, the amount of inflation depends on the measure used. Likely, some employers will try and talk CPIH as the lowest, and I suspect you end up wasting time telling them to use a proper measure. I don't know whether employers come at you with economic concepts like wage price spiral. I mean, I have seen the boss of a retailer on the telly putting putting her wage offer, putting their company's wage offer into the context of the wage price spiral and saying, she has to be partly responsible because of the wider economic conditions. But if someone does come at you with that, then the reality is we're in a completely different universe to one of a wage price spiral. As Suha pointed out earlier, real pay is declining at a near record pace. And this slide here is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund of all institutions, basically saying of the wage price spiral that if real wages have been negative prior to the inflation, so if real wages have been negative before we've got the inflation, which of course is the case in the UK, then a wage price spiral is highly unlikely. So we have it from the IMF, even the IMF reckon that. I guess the most obvious flashpoint in industrial disputes is profits versus wages. It's great for the union that can show workers are greatly disadvantaged when the employers and shareholders are profiteering. Any such firm can obviously take a hit on profits in order to pay higher pay. Though of course firms are affected to different extents by energy and raw material costs. But work has been done to show profit growth in 2021, and at the start of this year was in a pretty good place. So this next chart here, this chart compares labour income and profits since the trough of the global recession in 2009. Throughout, the profits of non-financial corporations in blue have run ahead of labour income in red. Even if anything, over the latest year, there might have been a slight widening of the gap, which is the point that United made, so that it looks like profits pulled a little bit further away from pay in the latest year. So profits have been running ahead against pay. I also mentioned a couple of results on the right there. Unite, the union, puts excellent work out on the growth in profit margins earlier this year. They showed that profit margins were up by 73% in 2021 compared to 2019, up from 9.1% from 5.3%. Then there was also analysis from the Institute of Public Policy Research, who showed an increase of 32% on average profits between 21 Q2 and 21 Q4 and the 3 years before the pandemic. So it is clear that some companies are experiencing very large profit margins, but I guess we have to concede that there's some uncertainty around the extent to which these gains apply across all industries. But then we have the Bank of England's own research from earlier this year. They found half of companies reporting that it was easier than normal to pass cost increases through to prices, while they found that 40% of companies said they had unsustainably low margins. A majority of those companies also expected to rebuild their profit margins over the coming year. So there are profits out there being made. For the public sector, I think I saw it in the chat about the public plan to limit public sector increases to 2% across the board. As we know, workers in public sector roles, and Suha's figures showed that workers in public sector roles are among those under the greatest pressure. The government has throughout talked tough on public sector pay. With renewed austerity, the pressures are only going to intensify. But we already know that such attacks will be counterproductive. We have evidence that workers are turning their back on certain public sector jobs and that many services as a whole have been cut beyond the brink. But we also know that giving public sector pay rises is a way of supporting the economy. And on this slide, it shows how in 2010 the government managed to prove this in reverse. The chart shows real pay levels back to just before the global financial crisis. And according to the government's theory, cutting back on the public sector would allow the private sector to expand. But instead, the public sector pay in grey and private sector pay in purple moved broadly together. The chart goes to 2021 and they ended up going nowhere together.
Thanks, Geoff. I think that's really helpful in understanding, how profit is doing and how that can affect wage rises or pay negotiations. But I think that in some ways, what you've just presented are just the tip of the iceberg. We know that those with power have done best. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, indeed. There's the iceberg.
Indeed.
So we TUC put out a lot of analysis around Congress to show how the inequalities in the economy have got greatly worse. Suha talked about how pay was back to its 2008 level. Other of our work shows that this is the worst pay crisis for 200 years. But on the other side of the divide, we find dividends growth is now 3 times pay growth, when previously, before the financial crisis, it was only double. We find financial wealth over roughly the same period increasing by 0.9 trillion, so up 80% from 1.1 trillion to 1.9 trillion. We find, as always, that the ratio between CEO pay and median earnings is very high at 109 times in the latest figures. And we've also put out data showing that the latest year is the best year on record for city bonuses. So maybe this isn't necessarily particularly useful in pay negotiations, but on Rich Trumpka, this is Rich Trumpka, who was the head of the United States Trade Union Federation, and he tragically and suddenly died last year at the absolute peak of his power. But he warned of these inequalities, that growing inequalities are putting us on a trajectory to implosion.
Thanks, Geoff. Now, at the start of the webinar, you mentioned a little bit that policy from the government appears to be making things worse. Can you explain a bit more about that, please?
Yeah. I mean, in fact, it's beginning to seem that every time the economy goes wrong, the solution, we're told, is that workers need to be poorer. To deal with, as we mentioned at the start, to deal with inflation, central banks have been raising interest rates. Central banks around the world have been raising interest rates since the end of 2021. These are the latest figures from the Bank of England that showed today rates going up to 3%. The same is true of all central banks, and in many ways they're being led by the Federal Reserve in the US, with consensus expecting their interest rates ahead to 5%. TUC opposes these rate increases as a too blunt tool. As the Bank of England themselves have said in the past, that they're treading a fine line between bringing down inflation and causing recession. But there are growing fears that the consequence will be recession, and in fact their own forecasts now show that the consequence will be recession. The most terrifying impact for households is, of course, on mortgage rates. The Resolution Foundation reckoned that 5 million families would see annual payments rising by an average of £5,000 between now and the end of 2024. You know, even in the context of the massive hikes for energy rises, these are absolutely eye-watering numbers. And then on top of this, we have Rishi Sunak. After the chaos of the Truss government, we now face Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt's renewed agenda of spending cuts. We know from the bitter experience of the past decade that looking at problems of the economy, as Rishi Sunak is doing here, as the problems of the public finances, rather than seeing it as the problem of the economy itself, but seeing it as a problem of public finances, will make things worse, not better. Rather than rate rises and spending cuts, we need policies to protect working people and to support higher pay, and so keep spending in the economy, and equally to support stronger public services and green investment as a foundation for a stronger economy. Beyond industrial disputes, this is what the TUC and trade unions will continue to fight for an economy that works for working people.
Thanks, Geoff. And obviously, we all want to get to that for an economy that works for working people, but also day to day, we know that, as I said, unions are negotiating pay deals. So, Anjum, can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of deals unions have negotiated and where they might have been particularly successful?
Yeah, sorry, we have actually been quite downbeat during this webinar, but the more positive side of things, where unionised workers are engaging in disputes, we are actually seeing some examples of good pay awards, and this table we've actually just pulled out of the from the Labour Research Department database, and that just gives you sort of, you know, some of the examples of the kind of rises that we're having. But just sort of more generally, you know, we actually want to support you with your campaigning, and we'd actually be interested to know if, you know, if you're actually using the sort of the data and the stats that we have been talking through today when you actually sort of go in and to sort of speak to employers. And I also sort of at this stage wanted to sort of plug our at TUC Economics account, which I think Anna will just pull up. It's on the next slide. We actually have a lot of our analysis on the economy and jobs market pay. Everything is actually on there. And that's where we're going to end for now. And obviously we'll open it up to questions.
Well, thanks all three of you for taking us through that. I think I learned a lot about especially the history of how we've got to where we are now, and how and why this is important when we're talking about wage negotiations. So we've had a couple of questions come in. I'm just going to quickly address the general ones that are more to me. Yes, we will share the slides and any other resources that are relevant. Please don't worry about that. You'll get a copy of them to look at in a bit more detail in your own time. Okay, so the first question that I'm gonna put to you is what are your thoughts about, if we're in negotiations, about introducing issues other than strictly pay? So maybe changes to terms and conditions, flexibility, you know, basically other things that aren't just monetary rewards. I mean, could I put that one maybe to you first, Geoff, and then come to Suha or Anjum?
I mean, the one thing that we noted, and Suha was talking about this earlier, was and the Bank of England pick it up today, is firms giving non-consolidated bonuses. So rather than a pay rise, again, like my retailer I was talking about earlier, announced a sort of cash reward for employees, but it's not, you know, it's instead of a pay rise, what you need is a regular pay rise, not just a one-off bonus. But there is some evidence, and we didn't put this in the presentation to avoid overdoing the charts, but there is growing evidence that firms have rather heavily been using one-off bonuses rather than consolidated pay rises. That's one way that they're trying to give a bit of money, but without delivering properly on what they should deliver.
Thanks for that, Geoff. Did you want to add anything to that answer, either of you, Anjum or Suha, especially if perhaps it affects inequalities perspective? No? Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Okay, 1 second. Right. What do you think has particularly driven the global prices for oil and food, for you know, in especially those things? You touched on a number of the reasons, like the war in Ukraine, but what other things might have changed this on a global scale? Shall I put that on to you as well, Geoff, first off?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that kicked it off is, you know, inflation was low throughout the pandemic. When the lockdowns began to end and the world economy began to pick up and people went back out and started spending more, it appeared that the global supply chain couldn't cope. You know, we now have very long and fragmented supply chains. We buy a lot of our goods from overseas, and the system was unable to cope and couldn't get from where they were produced to where they were, to where they want to be consumed. And this basically caused prices to go up. Heaped on top of that, of course, then comes the war and Putin's aggression in Ukraine, which hits gas prices in particular because of the reliance of the world on Soviet gas or Russia's gas, and also it's hit food prices very heavily because of, you know, Ukraine's big role in grain exports. These things then feed through. You know, it's hard to, you know, if you're a business, whatever you're doing, these things then feed from your energy prices, then feed into the cost of doing business. and becomes incredibly difficult. And that's why we see that the price rises started in energy, but as Suha's chart showed, that it's spread from energy right through to all sorts of prices in the economy.
Thanks, Geoff.
Someone said in the chat, actually, I saw that it's a cost inflation rather than a demand inflation, and I think that's an incredibly important point. That these are factors. You know, there was something to do with demand at the start when the economy began to pick up from the pandemic, but then it's mainly about increased costs. You know, this isn't an inflation that's caused by crazy excess in the country, and it's not caused by workers earning loads of money, going out and wanting more and more. It's caused by these external factors. And the kind of the bizarre thing, which I think the comment was referring to, is that, you know, you should treat, or policy should treat a cost inflation differently to a demand inflation. Right back at the start of the inflation, the Bank of England were quite reluctant initially. You know, they're almost going against their own advice. Initially, they were saying we shouldn't be raising interest rates because it's a cost inflation. But somewhere along the way, they switched horses, and they're raising interest rates nonetheless, which is one of the reasons why it's particularly alarming, because what's good for a what's right for a demand inflation isn't right for a cost inflation.
Thanks, Geoff. Next question I'm going to put to you first, Anjum. So we often hear about pay gaps, be they gender pay gaps or ethnicity pay gaps. Do you think that we can use that information when negotiating pay rises, from an equalities angle, bearing in mind some of the information you told us about of who's most affected by some of the economic issues?
Okay, well, we do actually do sort of like regular analysis on the gender pay gap and also on ethnicity as well, and along with disability as well. So any sort of like statistics that we can sort of provide, again, it would be useful to know some kind of feedback, because obviously we can provide more sort of detail on that. But yeah, I mean, certainly any sort of information available should be taken in, should be used for when you are doing negotiations.
Yes, thanks for that. Oh, yeah, we always say this. Obviously, when you are negotiating with management, whatever you're negotiating about, just always do your research, have your evidence to hand, and we all know that reporting on the gender pay gap is mandatory for some employers. So you can find out what the gender pay gap is in your organisation, and perhaps encourage them to do an ethnicity pay gap. It's not mandatory yet, but it's still useful information to have. Okay, I'm just looking at another question that has been posted. So what does the panel think about whether increasing taxes for those who are better off, would that be as effective as raising interest rates at keeping inflation down? Okay, who should I put that to first? Is that you, Geoff?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think it's the right idea. It's slightly less effective. Putting higher taxes on people who are better off is slightly less effective if you really want to drag demand out of the economy, because the better off don't spend as much of their money. But it would seem a more obvious and more fair. I mean, it seems that one of the most sensible things to do at the moment would be to do some redistribution, because we want to keep spending in the economy, because we're worried. It's a cost inflation. It's not a demand inflation. As people spend more and more on their electricity bills and their mortgage, they'll be spending less and less on everything in the shop. So anything that can put more money in people's pockets and the people who are going to spend it would be a good thing. So it would seem sensible to do actions that protect those on the lowest income, that keep money in their pockets. So that will protect them, and it will also keep them spending in the economy. And the obvious place to offset it is by putting some tax increases on the better off. So yeah, I think that's right.
That's great. Absolute, yes, but with a great explanation as well. So thank you. And before we take another question from our viewers, I've got a question for our audience. So I can see that there is some chat about, you using the information from this webinar and communicating it to your members. So I want to know if all the information presented by government about this issue, do union reps feel that misinformation or disinformation about wages is perhaps making your members more cautious about asking for pay rises? Now, I appreciate that you might want to go away and think about this, but if you do have the immediate answer, please tell us in the chat. Do you think information from government around this issue is making members more cautious about asking for pay rises? Do tell us. If not now, send your answers in, because we're really keen to know about this. Right, let me just see what other questions we've got here. Okay. All right. So another question that we had sent in advance is, what do the panel think about the idea that the government is obsessed with growth? Who wants to have a go at that? Is that for you, Geoff, or Suha? Shall I go to you first, Geoff, and then perhaps over to Suha?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's obsessed with growth at the moment. The trust fiasco was at one level underpinned by apparently her desire for growth. I think that obviously it's a peculiar, it's peculiar in a way for everyone to be lobbying for growth in the face of climate change. I think it makes sense to think about it more generally in terms of a stronger economy and better jobs. Growth is understood as the way to a stronger economy and better jobs. I think it's possible to have stronger growth that's stronger growth than at present, but that's focused on repairing the climate. But I did, the trust government point is an important point, because in a way, the trust government were right that there hasn't been, over the past decade, the growth has been incredibly weak. And one of the ways to finance public services is to have more growth. Her policy, the trouble with her initiative, of course, was that maybe it was right to call for more growth, but she went about it in the worst possible way. She went about it via the tax cuts for the wealthy, and in fact, attacking trade unions and all the usual stuff for everybody else. So I think it is okay to call for growth at the moment, because it's the economy is so weak. But that was very much the wrong way about it. And as we say, we've put out a lot of documents explaining how we would support the economy. And key to that is a massive package of infrastructure spending aimed at looking after the climate and aimed at new green energy sources. So I think whoever asked the question is absolutely right, that there is something a bit peculiar that we're all talking about growth, but there are ways to do that better than we do it at the moment. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Well, thanks for that explanation, Geoff. Suha, did you want to add anything to this? I'll go for it.
Yeah, we've had, I agree with everything Geoff said. We've had almost 2 decades of almost no growth in the economy. So it's a concern for us as well, the lack of growth. There are fair ways to achieve growth. There's green ways to achieve growth, equitable ways to achieve growth. But I think the main bone of contention was that we just didn't agree with the methods. Like, growth can't be driven by just the richest in society. And that sort of runaway growth for just a small portion of the population leads to everyone else being worse off, more exploited, the planet being more exploited. And we would like to see a return to growth that we had in the later half of the last century, but not in the way that Liz Truss suggested.
Thanks, Suha. So not at the expense of everything else being destroyed as well. Okay, I've got another question that it's more of a practical level, and I appreciate that you said earlier, Geoff, that you're not a negotiator, and I know that none of us here actually are. But if someone is negotiating pay in their workplace, what are the things that they should perhaps look for that might be warning signs or indicators in a employer's financial report or records? I know we obviously can't go into the real nitty gritty here, but what are the general things that might be alarm bells, or that might be useful information that they can then take to management when they're discussing a pay deal? Who wants to go first on that one? Come to you, Geoff, and then we'll go rounds.
I mean, I would use ONS figures. I would look for sort of industry norms in your industry. That can be helpful if your business is, or your firm is not keeping up with industry norms. There's mileage in finding out about how much profits the company's making, how much dividends the company's making. But I suspect that everybody knows these things, and I'm winging this a bit. But and then the wider context, if you can check out how the company's performing relative to the economy as a whole. So if it's a company that's growing very quickly, expanding a lot, then that must strengthen your case. So I suppose that's the point, isn't it? That the ONS figures offer you some benchmarks. The Office of National Statistics figures offer you some benchmarks for where the whole economy norm is. Up to a point, there's detail, as Suha showed, for industries and things like that. So there you can get a bit more context on where things are.
Thanks, Geoff. And Suha, as you talked a bit more about the ONS figures earlier, what are the key things within there that you need to look at? Because I think you look at these a lot all day. It's what you do. But if you're not familiar with looking at these figures, what are the key headlines or like chapter headings really that would be useful to someone in these negotiations?
Well, I think maybe the most useful one in terms of looking at benchmarking for other sort of like pay across the sector would be the ASH database. That's the annual survey of hours and earnings, and that's can be broken down into quite minute areas. I would say also it's quite useful just to try and turn things on the head whenever you can, because pay across the board has not been good. And while we can point to some examples, I think it's important to turn the debate and talk about how the costs are increasing for workers and how workers just need more money to get on board with that. We've seen that businesses are able to pass on costs quite easily to customers, and they're doing that on quite like a large basis. So if there's normally room for pay to increase for workers, and it needs to be a priority for businesses to pass on those pay rises to the workers. Otherwise, how can they have a decent standard of living?
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Suha. Right, thanks for that. So we're going to wrap up shortly, but I'm just going to ask you, which is probably the $1 million question, what I'm going to ask you about the future, which of course none of us have a crystal ball. We can't see what's going to happen. But bearing in mind the economic things that you've been, the economic perspective that you've been talking about, and that lots of unions are currently taking action or industrial action around pay, where do you roughly see the next year for pay? Do you think it's going to continue in the spiral, or do you think we might start to see some improvements? Now, don't worry, I won't quote you. I won't, this isn't going to go down in record, but let's just see what we think the future might look about. So just to see what we've got coming up on the horizon. So, Geoff, I'll go to you first.
I wish I had good news. I think the future is quite bleak for the economy. We have seen, and it's obviously brilliant, that unions have been getting good wins getting organised and getting public sympathy. But I guess the danger is that we're gonna find ourselves up against a weakening economy, and we see a lot of bankruptcy figures are up a lot recently, and the extent to which the Bank of England's forecast is right, and obviously it's not necessarily right. It does suggest that the economic conditions are going to be much worse. The thing we desperately need is for government, well, for the Bank of England to stop doing what it's doing, but also for the government, rather than retreating to the austerity mantra, is to stepping up and supporting things. That's we find it unbelievable that we're back in 2010 kind of debate, when we know that debate didn't work. That the government has to at some point start supporting things, and I think it probably will. Maybe it will when it realises that things are bad. But I think for the moment the economy is going to be make it for an increasingly challenging context.
Thanks for that, Geoff. I know we'd kind of started to move towards more positive, and we're maybe ending on a bit of a negative. But just want to give any final words to both Suha and then Anjum, just to before I wrap up. So Suha, final words from you, please.
It is obviously really concerning. The Bank of England today said that we were probably going to be heading towards near recession, and it's quite important to note that before the 2008 recession, we'd had sort of a decade or more of growth, of pay growth especially, and we were starting off in a much better position, whereas at the moment, like, people are already on the brink. A lot of workers are, already making the tough decisions between heating and eating as we're just starting to go into a recession. So it's particularly concerning, more so than it was even in 2008. Which I know isn't positive, isn't a positive ending.
Don't worry, we didn't like build this as feel good webinar, but it's useful and informative, and that's the main thing. Okay, Anjum, any last words?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to be sort of quite doomy like my sort of like colleagues. I mean, obviously we had the Bank of England report out today, and it's not looking too good sort of ahead with an imminent recession. But obviously policy does make a difference. We're going into that and we're actually cutting people's incomes, and obviously that just makes the recession worse. It's not the recession isn't because of an excessive demand. There's actually people just can't afford things at the moment, and it just puts everything sort of really into context, of income coming as well.
Were you just waving at me, Geoff?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing. I mean, so what gives me hope is that we're doing it wrong. The policy is wrong. The approach to workers is wrong. The approach to the wealthy is wrong. There is a correct way of doing it, and at some point they're going to have to see reason, because we've been trying for such a long time to do it the wrong way. So at some point people will see right, and I think that's why the campaigns on the news are incredibly valuable, because they point out that that this can't go on, and there is another way of doing it, and that's what I believe.
Absolutely.
Other people do.
Thank you. And I think another message that we can take from the chat, because I have been keeping up with it, is that lots of our viewers are saying that unions need to stick together and keep fighting, keep negotiating and campaigning on this issue and many issues, as we always do. And it's not always easy. There are a lot of obstacles, but it will help make differences, firstly in small ways, but ultimately in big ways, and that they're the steps we can take to help change this, and to help work towards an economy that does work for all and improves the lives of more people. So all that's left for me is to thank each of our speakers, to thank Geoff and Anjum and Suha for joining me today. It's been really useful and informative speaking to them. Thank you to you, the audience, for joining in, for asking such great questions and for getting involved in the chat. I look forward to seeing you online again soon for another webinar. There's not one... There'll be another one in a few weeks. I just can't remember what the subject is off the top of my head. Really sorry, but we will advertise it to you soon. Have a good rest of the week, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.